I had been in this country for 40 years. Over all that time I built exactly one thing I was truly proud of. Not the business. Not the truck. It was the house on Fernwood Crescent in Grimsby, Ontario. It had the blue window shutters my wife picked out in 2003. It had the front porch steps I poured myself one Saturday afternoon. I had spent my whole life caring for every single brick. I knew the rough feel of the wood on the railing. I knew the sound the front door made when the autumn wind pushed through. It was not just property. It was proof that I had existed. It was the place where I planned to take my last breath beside the woman I loved. But life always takes turns you never see coming. And one Thursday evening in October, I came home and found my wife standing at the gate with a bag. She was not in the garden. She was not sitting on the porch. She was standing right there at the iron gate. A canvas grocery bag sat at her feet. The wind was blowing her silver hair around, but her eyes were empty. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Leave a comment and make sure you subscribe. You're going to love it here. My name is Roland Beauchamp. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a residential construction contractor in the Niagara region before I retired. If you want to understand what kind of man I am, I will tell you this. On my last day of work, my crew threw me a retirement party. I spent most of it worrying about whether there would be enough food for everyone. I am the kind of person who always arrives early. I stay until the job is finished, and when I leave a work site, I always leave it better than it was when I first arrived. That is a principle. That is the honor of a man who works with his hands. I do not understand complicated financial terminology. I do not know how to bend the rules to get rich quickly. I believe in the strength of my hands and the integrity of my word. Life on Fernwood Crescent was the kind of quiet peace you only earn after 30 years of hard work. My wife Sandra and I had been married for 36 years. She used to teach elementary school and retired the spring before I did. That meant for the first time in our adult lives we were home together. No schedules, no alarm clocks, no obligations. Sandra was the kind of woman who could silence an entire room with just one look. But 5 minutes later she could have that same room laughing until people had tears in their eyes. She had extremely strong opinions about bird feeders. Never start a conversation about suet cakes unless you have 40 minutes to spare and nowhere else to be. We have one son. His name is Derek. He is 38 years old. He lives in Hamilton with his partner Joelle. Derek works in real estate. He is smart. He understands how things operate. More importantly, he knows how to make things sound like they work a certain way, even when they do not. I used to be proud of his sharp instincts. I thought it was the kind of skill someone needed to succeed in the modern world. But I was wrong. That very trait put him on the opposite side of me. That cleverness made him believe he could outsmart his own father. He forgot one simple thing. I am the man who poured the foundation for his life, and I know exactly where the cracks are. Things like this never happen out of nowhere. Cracks always appear before a structure collapses. As a contractor, I should have recognized that sooner. But when it is your own son, you tend to ignore the warning signs. You want to believe the best about them. That was my biggest mistake. Sandra was the soul of this house. She loved the garden more than anything. She could spend hours carefully picking off every leaf that had been eaten by insects. She used to say that plants needed to be listened to, too. I would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch her. That was my definition of peace. Sandra was not just my wife. She was the keeper of the flame. She was the reason my 40 years of hard work meant something. Then Derek started showing up more often last summer. Normally he only came by during holidays. But suddenly he was here on random weekdays. It started with very casual questions. He asked me about the maintenance costs of the house. He asked about property taxes in the Niagara region. One time we were sitting in the backyard. Derek looked up at the roof and said it looked like we might need to replace the shingles soon. He said everything was very expensive these days. Then he asked if I had ever thought about getting the house appraised. I looked at him and told him I did not care. I had no intention of selling. I was going to die in this house. Derek nodded. He gave a very professional smile. He said he only wanted what was best for us. He said the market was at its peak. Then there was the barbecue in August. Joelle came with him. Joelle also works in real estate. She had a very polished appearance, but her eyes were always calculating. Joelle held a glass of wine and walked slowly around the porch. She said the property was too large for two elderly people. She said cleaning and mowing the lawn would soon become a burden. Then she asked Sandra if she ever felt tired managing a place like this. I stood up right then. I told her I had poured the front porch steps myself. They were straighter than anything I had ever seen come out of a modern contractor's shop. I still had enough strength left to mow the lawn for another 20 years. Joelle smiled, trying to hide her irritation. She changed the subject, but I could feel something strange in the air, a quiet kind of hunger. September arrived with more frequent phone calls. Derek called me 3 times in 1 week. He kept asking about my long-term plans for the property. I answered very clearly. My long-term plan was to keep living here because this was where his mother and I belonged. He said, of course. He told me he was only asking from a future planning perspective. I told him the only perspective I cared about was stability. But Derek did not stop. He began shifting his attention to Sandra. One day I went to the hardware store to buy a few screws. When I came back, Sandra told me Derek had called her. He asked whether she had ever spoken with a lawyer about having her name on the property title. Sandra told him that was a matter between her and me. Then she offered him a cookie to end the conversation. She told me about it while we were eating dinner. She said it lightly, almost like she was talking about the weather. But I knew she was worried. That was how she handled things that made her uneasy. She brought them into the open, but with a small signal so I would understand she was thinking about it. I told her the house was in my name, and it had always been that way. She said she wanted another cookie. I knew that was where the conversation should end. At the time, I still thought Derek was just an overly cautious son. I thought he was obsessed with his profession. I thought he wanted to show his parents how smart he was. What I did not see was the greedy devil growing beneath those expensive suits of his. And I did not see the way he looked at our home as nothing more than a number on a balance sheet. He knew how to make things sound like they worked a certain way, even when they didn't. That was something he learned from the real estate world in Hamilton. Twisting numbers, turning lifeless documents into weapons. That trait made him successful. And that same trait put him directly against me. He had begun to see his own parents as obstacles that needed to be moved out of the way. That quiet tension lasted through the entire month of September. Every time the phone rang, I felt a small knot tighten in my chest. Derek called again one Thursday. This time he talked about restructuring assets to avoid inheritance taxes later on. He used legal terms I had never heard before. I cut him off and told him not to worry about my money. I was still perfectly capable of managing my own life. He went silent for a long moment before hanging up. That silence was the calm before the storm. What I did not know was that while I was preparing the house for the coming winter, my son was preparing a plan to push us out. He was drafting documents that looked official. He was rehearsing lies designed to take advantage of his mother's trust. He was waiting for a moment when I was not home. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching this video from. I genuinely want to know. Your curiosity is what motivates me. Because this story isn't just about me. It's for everyone who has spent their whole life building a home only to see it threatened by the very people they love the most. On that fateful Thursday in October, I had gone to Street Catherine's. I was helping Frank Dooley, my old foreman, move some equipment around on his property. Frank was 71 years old. He refused to hire anyone because he believed nobody else did the job properly. Most of the time he was right. We worked together the whole day. I got home around 6 in the evening. I felt that familiar satisfaction a man gets after doing something useful with his own hands. My muscles were a little sore, but my spirits were good. I turned onto Fernwood Crescent. I was expecting to see the warm lights from the living room. I was expecting to smell Sandra's cooking. But instead I saw her standing at the gate. Not in the garden, not on the porch. Right at the gate. She had a bag beside her. The same canvas grocery bag she always used when she went shopping. I pulled the truck to the curb. I stepped out and looked at her face. My heart tightened in my chest. She said only one word. Roland. Her voice was shattered. And in that instant I knew. The nightmare I had felt creeping in since the summer had finally taken shape. Derek had come here. He had come while I was away. And he had brought papers that could destroy our entire world. I stood there under the pale October sunset. I looked at the woman who had stood beside me for 36 years. the woman I had promised to protect. And now she was standing outside her own home with a grocery bag at her feet. A fury began rising in my veins. A cold kind of anger I had never felt before in my life. I didn't shout. I didn't break anything. I walked over and took her hand. It was ice cold. I told her, "Let's go inside." She shook her head and said Derek told her we no longer had the right to be here. I looked straight into her eyes and said, "This is our home. It always has been. And I'm going to show him just how big of a mistake he's made." The next part of this story is where things truly become dramatic. That is when I began my journey to reclaim justice. But first I needed to understand exactly what had happened during the 2 hours I was gone. I needed to know what my own son had said to his mother that made her pack her belongings into a grocery bag. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next will show you the power of a father pushed to his limit, and you'll understand why my lawyer is known as the man with the voice of a judge. The battle had only just begun, and I can promise you this, I have never left a job unfinished in my life. I led Sandra into the house. She walked like a stranger in her own living room. I set the canvas bag on the kitchen table. Inside were only a few pieces of clothing and an old photo album. My chest tightened when I saw that. Derek had convinced his own mother that this was all she was allowed to take from her own life. I forced myself to stay calm. I poured her a glass of water. I took a slice of lemon cake from the cabinet. It was her favorite. Then I sat down across from her and gently held her trembling hands. "Sandra," I said softly, "tell me everything, word for word." She began to speak. Her voice was so quiet that I had to hold my breath to hear it. Derek had come early that afternoon. He hadn't come alone. Joelle was with him. They brought a thick stack of documents. They weren't ordinary real estate papers. They were printed on formal stationery. There were red seals. There were signatures that looked official and convincing. Derek told Sandra the house had been transferred into his name. He said it was part of a long-term estate arrangement that I had supposedly signed. He told her the lawyer had confirmed everything. He used words like process and transition, confusing her with legal language. Sandra asked where I was. Derek told her I already knew about it. He said I was out taking care of the final paperwork. That was the most shameless lie imaginable. He used the trust she had in me as the knife he drove into her back. He stood right there in this kitchen, the same kitchen where Sandra had cooked thousands of meals for him, the same place where she had bandaged his scraped knees when he was a boy, and he told her to leave. He said he didn't want things to become unpleasant. Joelle stood beside him and began inspecting the house like an inventory clerk. She looked at Sandra's porcelain cups. She touched the curtains. Sandra said she felt like an intruder in her own home. She was scared. She didn't want to cause trouble for me. So she took the canvas grocery bag and packed only a few things. She had stood at the gate for an entire hour waiting for me. She didn't dare go back inside. She believed she no longer had the right to use her own key. The cruelty of what Derek had done went far beyond anything I could have imagined. He didn't just want the property. He wanted to strip his own mother of her dignity. A cold feeling spread through me, all the way down to the bone. This was the son I had taught how to hold a hammer. This was the child I had raised to believe that a man's word was the most important thing he had. And now he was using his intelligence to drive away the woman who had given him life. I stood up. I didn't say a word about the anger burning inside me. I didn't want Sandra to be any more afraid than she already was. I walked to the hallway closet and took out my phone. I knew exactly who I needed to call. I called Margaret Voss. Margaret had been my lawyer for 11 years. She was 52 years old and had a voice as sharp and firm as a judge delivering a sentence. She never wasted words. She answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't dress it up with emotion. I simply laid out the facts. Margaret was silent for exactly 4 seconds. They were the longest 4 seconds of my life. Then she spoke. "Roland, the property title is in your name alone. It has been that way since the day you bought it, and it has never changed." She said no one could touch that documentation without her knowing. She said whatever Derek showed Sandra was not a legal transfer of ownership. She was willing to stake her professional reputation on that fact. I asked, "What do we do now, Margaret?" Her answer came in a cold, steady voice. "You don't need to do anything tonight. I'll handle everything. The anger inside me finally had a clear direction. I looked out the kitchen window. The house was still standing there. The porch steps were straight beneath the moonlight. Derek thought he understood the law. He thought a stack of forged papers could steal 40 years of my life. He had made a fatal mistake. He had forgotten that I was a contractor. I never tear something down unless I have a solid plan to rebuild it stronger than before. And I never leave a job unfinished. I returned to the kitchen table. Sandra had finished her glass of water. She looked at me, searching my face. I said, "Sandra, no one can throw you out of this house. Tomorrow your son is going to learn a lesson he will never forget." I looked at the canvas bag sitting on the table. It had become a symbol of betrayal, but it was also the spark that had ignited the fire inside me. I would not stop until Derek understood something very simple. There are things in this world that must never be bought, sold, or manipulated. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch staring down the road that led out of Fernwood Crescent. I was waiting for the light of Friday morning, the day Derek's world would begin to collapse. I knew I was doing the right thing. I was protecting my wife. I was protecting the work of my life. And more than anything, I was teaching my son what consequences truly mean. If you believe Derek's actions are unforgivable, press the like button right now. It lets me know I'm not alone in this fight. Everything was already in motion. Margaret Voss was working. Terence Bowl was waiting for my call. And Derek, he was probably celebrating his fake victory somewhere in Hamilton. He had no idea a storm was heading toward him with the force of a legal judgment. My name is Roland Beauchamp. I arrive early. I stay until the job is finished. And tomorrow my job is to clean up the mess my son left behind in this house. His game ended the moment he made his own mother stand at the gate with a grocery bag. That night, the kitchen, normally the warmest place in the house, felt strangely cold. Margaret Voss wasn't just a lawyer. She was a protector. Her voice carried no hesitation when she spoke. What Derek had done, she said, wasn't just a lie. It was fraud, an attempt to deceive someone into surrendering property that was never his to claim. I stood in the darkness of the hallway, listening to the sound of Margaret typing on the other end of the line. She told me she would draft a formal trespass notice immediately. She said she would make sure Derek could never step foot on my lawn again without risking being handcuffed by the police. By morning, she said, your son will receive an official no trespass notice delivered to his address in Hamilton. She paused for a moment before speaking again. This time her tone shifted slightly. I'm taking this personally, Roland. I cannot believe a son would force his own mother out of her home with nothing but a grocery bag. I thanked Margaret and ended the call. But I still couldn't sit down. I needed to talk to someone who understood me. 40 minutes later, I called Terence Bowl. Terence and I had been close friends for 29 years. We had worked together since the early 90s. In all that time, we had never gone more than 2 weeks without speaking. He answered before the second ring. I told him what had happened. He went quiet. It was the heavy silence of a man who also had children of his own. Then he said slowly, he told Sandra to leave the house, his own mother, with a bag. Yes, I said. A grocery bag. Roland. He murmured. I know. He asked if I was all right. I looked out toward the backyard where the shadow of the maple tree stretched across the fence. I took a long breath. I'll be better than Derek is going to be tomorrow morning. Terence made a sound that wasn't quite laughter, but it was close. Well, he said, Margaret Voss is terrifying. That was exactly my plan, I replied. He told me I probably wouldn't sleep that night. I said I'd be fine. He insisted I wasn't fine at all. He was right. I wasn't fine, not even a little. I returned to the kitchen table with Sandra. She had calmed down, but the pain was still deep in her eyes. She stared at the unfinished slice of lemon cake on her plate. I kept thinking you would walk in any minute, she said quietly. I told her I was sorry I hadn't been there sooner. She placed her hand over mine. She told me I had been there. That was what I always did. Hearing that hurt more than any insult Derek could have thrown at me. It made me realize that I had a responsibility to cleanse this ugliness from our lives. I spent the entire night staring at my phone, watching the clock crawl forward minute by minute. 2:00 a.m., 4:00 a.m., 6:00 a.m. Every second that passed was one step closer to Derek's collapse. I imagined the look on his face when the process server knocked on the door of his house in Hamilton. He was probably dreaming about selling this house. He was probably calculating the commission he thought he would make. What he didn't know was that Margaret Voss had already cast a legal net with no way out. Before I revealed Derek's reaction when he received the notice, "Tell me something. Do you think I went too far with my own son?" Leave your opinion in the comments below. Your support gives me the strength to keep going, because sometimes forgiveness means allowing the person who committed the wrong to face the full consequences of their actions. At 7:30 Friday morning, Margaret sent me the draft of the letter. At 8:15, confirmation came through the notice had been served. The trespass order was now in Derek's hands. I was drinking coffee in the kitchen when my phone started vibrating. It was Derek. He called at 8:42. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 8:51. This time I answered. His voice was shaking. "Dad, what's going on? I just received a trespass notice." I let him talk. I let him sit in the confusion and fear he had created for himself. I wasn't in a hurry. A good contractor always knows when it's time to drive in the final nail. Then I spoke, my voice calm and steady. "Derek, I want you to listen very carefully to this. Your mother stood at the gate of her own home with a grocery bag because you told her to leave. Sit with that thought for a moment before we continue." He started rambling about future planning. He said he only wanted to help us. He claimed he was worried we might not be strong enough to take care of the house anymore. I cut him off. I told him Margaret had checked the property title. The house was mine. It had always been mine. There was no transfer, no agreement, none of the things he had told his mother ever existed. I asked him if he understood what I was saying. Silence. The kind of silence you hear from someone who has just been caught stealing. Then I continued. "You walked into my house and scared your own mother so badly that she packed her belongings. Whatever you expected would happen when I came home, it didn't. And now this is what will happen next. You are not welcome on this property anymore. That's what the notice means. Sandra and I will decide in the coming weeks whether we even want to speak to you again. But I wouldn't suggest holding your breath." Then I ended the call. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and felt a strange sense of relief, like clearing away a pile of debris after a violent storm. Sandra looked at me. She didn't say a word, but I could see the understanding in her eyes. We hadn't just taken back our home. We had taken back the truth. And Derek would have to learn how to live with that truth somewhere far away from Fernwood Crescent. The legal battle might still continue. But the battle inside this house was over, and the winner was integrity. The following Monday was a clear blue day. I drove to Margaret Voss's office. I wasn't there to negotiate. I was there to put an end to everything. Margaret was sitting behind her desk with a stack of prepared files. She looked up at me and nodded. It was the kind of nod you get from a true ally. We spent 2 hours reviewing everything carefully. I didn't want to leave a single gap for greed to crawl through. That Monday I went over my will with Margaret. Derek's name was removed from the inheritance. I asked her how long it would take to finalize the paperwork. Margaret told me she already had the amendment drafted. She said she had expected me to come in sometime that week. I told her she was an extraordinary woman. She simply smiled and said she already knew that. That evening I told Sandra during dinner. She stayed quiet for a long moment. She looked out toward the garden where the birds were settling in for the evening. Then she said it was my decision. I told her that it was. She said Derek had frightened her in her own kitchen. She kept thinking I would walk through the door any second. I took her hand and promised her that would never happen again. That Saturday, Terence came by. The three of us sat on the porch until the air turned cool. Terence brought a coffee cake. He insisted his daughter had made it, but we all knew he had baked it himself. Sandra complimented the cake, and Terence looked like a man who had just won a major award. When Sandra went inside to heat more water, Terence leaned closer to me. He asked how I was really feeling. I looked out at the backyard. The maple tree in the corner had already dropped most of its leaves. The leaves had gathered along the fence, the way they always did every October. Sandra had been telling me to rake them for 4 days straight. I said I would rake those leaves tomorrow. Terence said that wasn't what he was asking. I told him I knew. I was fine. Better than I expected, actually. Terence nodded. He understood that for someone like me, work is often the best way to heal. Sandra came back and refilled our teacups. She looked at Terence and said he had made that cake himself and that we all knew it. Terence laughed and admitted it had been a collaborative effort. Sandra sat down and lifted her cup of tea. She looked completely at ease. She looked like a woman who had never once had to pack a bag and leave her own home. And that was exactly how I wanted it to be. This story has been an expensive lesson for me, and maybe for you as well. Never confuse kindness with weakness. I may be a loving father, but I am also a contractor who knows how to tear out what has rotted. If a foundation has been damaged by dishonesty, you cannot keep building on top of it. My advice to you is simple. Protect what you have built at all costs. Do not allow anyone, even those closest to you, to manipulate your trust. Integrity is the greatest asset a man can possess, and sometimes the greatest love you can show a misguided child is to let them stand on their own 2 feet without the support of your inheritance. Thank you for staying with me through the end of my story. If you think this lesson has value, share it with a friend who might need to hear it. My name is Roland Beauchamp. My job is finished. The house on Fernwood Crescent is peaceful again, just as it always was meant to be. The porch steps are still straight, the doors are still strong, and we are still here, together,